anti-treaty side, he was jailed for that, learned Gaelic, did a lot of reading while he was in jail, went on to become a librarian, director of the Abbey Theatre, lecturer on literature, and one of Ireland's great short story writers. Died in 1966. On one occasion he wrote a short story about a young fella in Cork, back around the early 1900s, who was about to make his first confession. He's about 7 or 8, and we let the young fella tell it himself. All the trouble began when my grandfather died, and my grandmother, my father's mother, came to live with us. Relations in the one house were strained at the best of times, but to make matters worse, my grandmother was a real old country woman and quite unsuited to life in the town. She had a fat, wrinkled old face, and to Mother's great indignation, she went around the house in bare feet. The boots had her crippled, she said. For dinner she had a jug of Guinness and a pot of potatoes, and she poured out the potatoes on the table and ate them slowly with great relish, using her fingers by way of a fork. Now, girls are supposed to be fastidious, but I was the one who suffered most from this. Nora, my sister, just sucked up to the old woman. For the penny she got every Friday out of the old age pension, a thing I couldn't do. I was too honest, that was my problem. And when I was playing with Bill Connell, the Sergeant Major's son, and saw my grandmother steering up the path with a jug of Guinness sticking out from beneath her shawl, I was mortified. I made excuses not to let him come into the house to play with me, for I could never be sure of what that old woman would be up to if he came in. When Mother went out to work and my grandmother made the dinner, I wouldn't touch it. Nora once tried to make me, but I hid under the kitchen table and I took the bread knife with me for protection. Nora had on to be very indignant. She wasn't, of course, but she knew Mother saw through her, so she sided with Gran. She came after me. I lashed out at her with the bread knife, and after that she left me alone. I stayed there till Mother came in from work and made my dinner. But later, when Father came in, Nora said to him in a shocked tone, "Oh, Dada, do you know what Jackie did at dinner time?" Then, of course, it all came out. Father gave me a flaking. Mother interfered, and for days after he never spoke to me, and Mother only barely spoke to Nora, all on account of that old woman. God knows I was heart scalded by her. Then, to crown my misfortunes, I had to make my first confession in communion. It was an old woman called Ryan who prepared us for this. She was about the same age as Gran. She was well-to-do, lived in a big house in Montenotte, wore a black cloak and bonnet, and came to school every day at 3 o'clock when we should have been going home, and spoke to us about hell. Now, she may have mentioned the other place as well, but that could only have been by accident. For hell had the first place in her heart. She lit a candle, took out a new half-crown from her handbag, and offered the first boy who would hold one finger, just one finger, in the tiny flame for 5 minutes by the school clock. Being always very ambitious, I was dying to volunteer, but I thought it might seem greedy. Then she asked us, were we afraid to hold one finger? Just one finger in a tiny flame, and not afraid of burning all over in roasting hot furnaces for all eternity. All eternity, just think of that. A whole lifetime goes by and there's not even a drop in the ocean of your suffering. Gee, the woman was really interesting about hell. But my attention was all fixed on the half-crown. When she was finished, she put it back in her handbag. It was a great disappointment to me. A religious woman like that, you'd think she wouldn't bother about a little thing like a half-crown. Another evening, she told us about a priest she knew who woke one night to see a fellow he didn't recognise leaning over the edge of the bed. He was a bit frightened, naturally enough, but he asked the fellow what he wanted, and the fellow said in a deep, husky voice that he wanted to go to confession. The priest said it was a sort of an awkward time, and wouldn't it do in the morning? But the fellow said, no, the last time he went there was one sin he held back, being afraid to mention it, and now it was always on his mind. The priest knew then this was a really bad case, for the fellow had committed a mortal sin, made a bad confession. He got up to get dressed, and just then the rooster crew in the yard outside, and lo and behold, when the priest turned around, there was no trace of the fellow, only the smell of burning timber. And when he looked down, he saw the print of 2 hands burnt on the bedclothes. Gee, that story made a shocking impression on me. But the worst of all was when she taught us how to examine our conscience. Did we take the name of the Lord our God in vain? Did we honour our fathers and our mothers? I asked her if that included grandmothers, and she said it did. Did we love our neighbours as ourselves? Did we covet our neighbours' goods? And I remember the way I felt about the penny that Nora got every Friday out of the old age pension. I decided between one thing and the world. I had broken the whole 10 of the commandments. All on account of that old woman. And so long as she remained in the house, I had no hope of ever doing anything else. I remember the day that we had to go to confession. Nobody could come with me. My mother was out at work, so she sent Nora instead. Now that girl had ways of tormenting me that mother never dreamt of. She held my hand as we went down to the chapel, smiling sadly all the while as if she were taking me to hospital for an operation. Oh, God help us, Jackie, she says, isn't it a terrible pity you weren't a good boy? Oh, Jackie, my heart bleeds for you. Don't forget to tell him about the time you kicked Gran in the shin. I don't want to go to confession at all. I dragged myself away from her. But she says, sure, you'll have to go to confession. Sure, if you don't, the priest might be up to the house looking for you. It isn't now that I'm not sorry for you. Do you remember the time you went for me with the bread knife under the kitchen table? And the language you used. I don't know what he'll do with you at all. He might have to send you to the bishop. I remember thinking bitterly to myself that if she only knew the half of what I had to tell, if I told her. And I understood perfectly well why the fella in Mrs. Ryan's story had made a bad confession. I thought it was a great shame that people wouldn't stop criticising him. I remember the long steep hill down to the chapel and the sunlit hillsides beyond the valley of the river, which I saw in gaps between the houses like Adam's glass glimpse of paradise.